It's such a great experience having a female scholar on our campus, and it's something that we are really excited to share with you all today. So following Sister Amina's talk, we're going to break out into small groups for a student-led discussion and reflection. I want to give a special thanks to our facilitators from NYU, Mariam Abu Quaid, Rida Ali and Asma Bola, from Yale, Shayan Sabzwari and Yusra Omar, and from Columbia, Maisha Chaudhry, Dania Jaffrey, Edna Eagle, Zara Tayyibji, Amran Muhammad, and Ayman Naja. They all helped put together this event, and with that, I'm going to pass it on to Sister Amina.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's really good to see everyone. I miss you guys. Ramadan Mubarak. I was hoping to talk a little bit about women in the Quran, inshallah. And the first woman we meet in the Quran is actually our mother Hawa alayhi salam, when we were talking about the creation of just humanity in general and why we are on earth, and the angels are asking, it's like, what's up with Adam alayhi salam, like what's happening? The very first woman we are introduced to in the Quran is actually our mother Eve. And throughout that story, you see how both Adam and Hawa alayhim salam, they both ate from the tree together. They both descended from heaven together. They both repented together. And that the fact that there is no misconception, like there's no notion of like, she is more guilty. And there's this idea of like, she's the one that tricked him. That is not an Islamic idea at all. They both collectively did this, and it was the intention of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for humanity to live on earth in the first place. So it's not something that evil Hawa did this. That's not what it is at all. And so the next woman we are introduced to in the Quran is actually Maryam alayhi salam's mom. And she is having this conversation with Allah, and she's saying, Ya Allah, I've dedicated this child to you. This child will live in the temple. They will serve you. And then she has Maryam alayhi salam, and she's like, it's a girl. I was expecting a boy. I was expecting a man that will be able to be a prophet. And in that verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more aware of about the gender of her child. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the male is not like the female. And in that moment, Sayyidah Maryam alayhi salam, in that moment in history, she is preparing that society for what they need to be prepared for in a way that only a woman can. And I think it's really fascinating that in that ayah, it's saying, no, only Maryam alayhi salam could have done this. And the Quran continues, and there are a number of women that are mentioned in the Quran, none that are mentioned by name besides Maryam alayhi salam, but there are a lot of discussion of a lot of women in the Quran. There's a point in the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps referring to, and there's this idea of zawj. So zawj, if you ask people that are Arab, it's like, oh, it means husband. It actually means complementing pair. And it's a term that is used interchangeably for both a husband or a wife. And it means that you are equal and complementary. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this a number of times in the Quran. I'm trying to see if I can share it in the chat for everyone to see. If anyone wants to look at the verses. Whoop, wrong thing. But if anyone wants to look at the verses and you see these ayat, and it's saying that male and female are complementing to each other. So for example, in the beginning of Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O people, be mindful of your Lord who created you from a single soul and created from it its zawj, وَخَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا. And that the two of them are complementing to each other. And then from that pair, Allah spread from them countless men and women far and wide. And the ayah says, be mindful of God in whose name you make requests of one another, and beware of severing the ties of kinship. Allah is always watching over you. So the ayah is reminding us of our shared family bond through our father and our mother, Adam and Eve, alayhim salam. But it's also saying that the two of them are complementary pairs. The beautiful thing about this is that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, then He is by definition the only one that is not in need of anyone else. And if you are inherently part of a pair, you are inherently in need of someone else. And it's saying that we as human beings were designed to be imperfect and designed to need each other. And I think that's really, really cool. And the idea of balancing male and female in society, when the balance is off, it ends up hurting everyone. You guys all know that game where you hold someone's hand and you go really fast in a circle? Like if you're holding a child, the child is flying because your weight is heavier than the child. Whereas if you're holding someone's hand and you're both balanced, like that, you can basically balance each other out. And I'm going to have a nerd moment for a second, but most stars in the universe are actually pairs that are rotating around each other, because the majority of things in the universe are actually two pairs that are rotating around each other. And this is part of the balance of male and female on earth, but it's also the balance of just the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in general. So that's, generally speaking, there's an idea of there has to be balance between the genders. There are a number of ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, where actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically mentions al-dhakar wal-untha. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, in that same surah, وَمَا يَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا مِنْ ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى. And that repeats again and again, and every single time, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In 6 verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in 5 verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically says, dhakar wal untha, male and female. And in each of those verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whoever does righteous deeds, in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they are the ones that will be rewarded. So every time male and female is mentioned, it keeps referring back to is like, just do righteous deeds. I.e., in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the two are equal inherently, and what makes you valuable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is whether you actually did the deeds that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted you to do, and you behaved in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to behave, i.e., be kind to each other, worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. But it's not saying, okay, but you sit here and you sit there. And then the last verse that I had mentioned was Sayyidah Maryam alayhi salam, where she's saying male and female are not the same. Because and it's this discussion that they have in feminist circles about like equity versus equality. You guys have all seen that meme about like people watching the baseball game? Anyone? And then there's like 3 people. There's a really tall person that doesn't need a box, and then there's like a medium height person that does need a box. Alhamdulillah, I got a thumbs up from Mikhail. And a really short person that needs 2 boxes. That's the difference between equity and equality. If we are saying that it feels almost self-defeatist to say men and women are exactly the same. Because in most societies, men are the standard. And if I'm saying women are exactly like men, then we're saying, well, why aren't you behaving like them? What's wrong with you? And it's still holding men as the standard. Where if we say that, look, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created most people as male or female, this is just a part of your experience on earth, and because you have a different experience doesn't negate your humanity. Your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what makes you a believer, not your relationship with other people. But at the end of the day, you are still a human being in the eyes of Allah, but I'm acknowledging the differences of people's experience. And I think the part of this that makes the most amount of sense to me is like when the Black Lives Matter movement started, all these people kept saying, but all lives matter. Yeah, but there's only one group that's dealing with police brutality. Well, actually, indigenous people are also dealing with police brutality. But it was, in a sense, trying to erase people's experience by saying, no, we're all the same. No, some of us have a more difficult time in society. And I feel like acknowledging that women have a different experience is to celebrate them and to give them the space to be the women they want to be. I feel like even in my relationships with other chaplains, women are more likely to tell me about people that are not necessarily good people in the community, and I can call the other chaplains and I'm like, hey, this happened and that happened. And we can support each other in different ways because the women are more likely to complain to me than they are to the male chaplains. And that doesn't in any way, shape, or form take away from what they're doing. If it comes down to it, they're probably the person that you're going to have to, bring this person out and make them leave the space or whatever it is. So we're having these conversations back and forth. And I feel like it's really important to talk about them so that we are actually complementing and supporting each other. So that was the first part. That's in terms of the theory of gender in the Quran. There are a number of ayat where different women are speaking, because one of the misconceptions that I don't know why, anyways, there's this statement that people say, Sawtul mar'a awra. The voice of a woman is inherently something that she should keep to herself. And the response, I actually really appreciate the response where it's saying Sawtul mar'a thawra. No, a woman's voice is revolutionary. Shh, don't say that. And the response to that, more importantly, is these are all the women in the Quran that spoke. If you want to search through the Quran and it says qalat, she said, There are so many women that are speaking for themselves. Maryam alayhi salam, like whether they're speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether they're speaking publicly, whatever they're doing, they are speaking out. We have the queen of Balqis alayhi salam who followed Sulaiman alayhi salam. And again, anytime someone's like, women can't be leaders, and I'm like, I raise you a righteous queen in the Quran. Like, shh. Because clearly the Quran gave us an example of this woman. That is someone that followed the Prophet, led her people to Jannah. Like, come on. As opposed to Pharaoh. And I remember having a conversation with someone where he's like, this person said, yes, but she ended up following Sulaiman alayhi salam. Like, yes, she did, because he's a prophet, not because he's a man. We don't follow Pharaoh because he's a man, because he's a horrible person. We follow Musa alayhi salam because he's a prophet. SubhanAllah. And I just thought that was really, really fascinating. So, and then people that spoke in the Quran, one of them is the mother of Maryam alayhi salam, Maryam alayhi salam herself. Actually, one of her miracles, she came back carrying Isa alayhi salam, this newborn child, and they come in, and as soon as she walks in, like, this is the woman that lives in the temple, all she does is feed the poor and pray all day. And they're like, oh my God, Maryam, what have you done? And they're slut-shaming her. If she can't defend herself, like, literally nobody can. And she walks back into the city, and instead of responding to people, she just points to Isa alayhi salam, this child, and as soon as she points at him, they're like, what are we gonna do? Talk to a baby? And Isa alayhi salam actually speaks and defends his mother. And I just think it's really fascinating also in terms of like the idea of like male allyship. This lack of balance is just as destructive to men as it is to women. It is just a destructive way to be doing things in our society. And even as a child, as a baby, Isa alayhi salam is defending his mother. And there's so many points in the Quran, almost every time he is mentioned in the Quran, he is mentioned as Isa, the son of Maryam alayhi salam. And it's so beautiful, the dynamic that they both have. And it's saying that essentially Maryam alayhi salam was preparing her patriarchal society to be able to receive Isa alayhi salam. There had to have been a cultural shift before this community was even able to receive Isa alayhi salam, which I think is really beautiful. During the current pandemic, most countries that have women in leadership are doing a lot better than the ones that don't. And it's not to say that women are just inherently better leaders. It is because if you have a society where you are putting people in power based on what they are able to do and based on their qualifications, not based on their gender, then you will have a more balanced society in general. So like a state like Ohio where the governor is a man, but the health commission, the head of the health department is a woman, they balanced each other out and they had these conversations back and forth, and the death toll in Ohio was a lot lower than it was in other states. They acted faster than everyone else. This idea of putting people in power based on qualifications and not based on gender is what I think is the most critical conversation that we should be having, of how do we actually empower the right people. And if women are inherently being told, like, just sit down and be quiet and don't talk, first of all, that's out of line of like the women in the Quran, the women at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it's just out of line of what it means to be a Muslim woman. I remember during the 2016 election, Linda Sarsour and I literally drove to all the mosques in Ohio, trying to convince the Muslims to get out the vote. And the number of Muslims that are like, but is it hayat for you to go out and talk to people? I'm like, yes it is, because we learned hayat from the women at the time of the Prophet, and when they saw injustice, they spoke out. Like, what is this warped idea of hayat that you have? Also, it's so insulting that, like, Linda Sarsour is coming to your state and she's driving around talking to all the mosques, and they're like, but are you actually a good Muslim woman? And I'm like, please just shut up. SubhanAllah. This idea that women, like, it's a very frustrating idea that women shouldn't be able to speak out. If you see injustice, you should speak out. All of us, male and female. SubhanAllah. I know it was terrifying. It was really embarrassing to be in that space, but alhamdulillah, it's okay. That's just one example, though, of just a toxic idea of what it means to be a Muslim woman. There's another example in the Quran, and I feel like it's important to talk about how and why these dynamics work so that we're not we're not internalizing the negative, like the patriarchy that is not inherent to our religion. I remember one of my teachers, because I really struggled with this. You would read the tafsir of the Quran, and you would read different scholars throughout Islamic history, especially the verse about 2 female witnesses. And I would ask my teachers, like, because some of them were like, oh, it's because women's memories are bad. And I'm like, that's not a thing. Like, I know that's not a thing. Because a third of the Sunni tradition came through Aisha radiallahu anha. Like, all of those narrations, like a third of Sunni Islam came from a woman. Like, you can't just dismiss that. And you can't say she has a bad memory inherently because she's a woman. That doesn't make sense. Like, there's so many things in our tradition that fly in the face of that, of like, and it's both in the Shia and Sunni traditions, that you have single female narrators of hadith. So if we're trusting them with the words of the Prophet ﷺ, then clearly we can trust them to tell us what happened in a business deal. Like, that doesn't make sense. Why is this ayah specifying 2 female witnesses? And I remember having the conversation with one of my teachers, and I'm very grateful to him. He said, check each of the authors of those tafsir. If his book was published by the political authority of the time, then he's going to be disparaging to women. And if his book was published by his community and was supported because he brought balance to his community, he will have a far more balanced view. And again, this is true male or female. Unfortunately, there are not as many female books that are published as there are male books. And that's a separate rant. They do that in science. They do that, unfortunately, in everything. The 2 dudes that got the Nobel Prize for the DNA sequencing, and then the woman that's just like, actually, I took that picture, said almost every woman that has discovered anything. Anyways, it's a separate rant. The reason that makes sense is if you are focused on maintaining a hierarchy in society, then you want people to accept patriarchy in their homes. You want people to accept within their most intimate spaces that one person is inherently above the other. Therefore, it's okay in society for the rulers, this elite class, to be maintaining their position above everyone else in society. So there's a very real reason why and this isn't to disparage all of their work, a lot of them have contributed really great things, and at the end of the day, take the good and leave the bad. So I remember reading this ayah, and I used to be on the board in my masjid for like 4.5 years, and I was the only woman for a lot of it. And I would be sitting in the meeting, and there's so many days where I'm like, I wish I had another woman. And anytime it turned into like an ego fight, everybody's like bickering with each other, it was like I was invisible in the room. And as soon as we needed to figure out what was happening in the masjid, everybody went quiet and turned around and looked at me like, Sister Amina, what's actually happening? And I'm like, oh, now you want to hear what I have to say. But there were moments where I was like, if only I had another woman in this space, she could echo what I was saying. And that was the moment where I realized, I'm like, that's why you have the other female witness. So there are 2 ways to actually recite this ayah, where it's talking about the 2 female witnesses, where it's saying فَتُذَكِّرْ إِحْدَاهُمَا الْأُخْرَى, that one of them reminds the other one. And there's another recitation of it that says فَتَذْكُرْ إِحْدَاهُمَا الْأُخْرَى, where one of them reminds of the other. And some of the mufassirun that I really appreciate that had this very egalitarian view, that they're saying that the second woman is like her lawyer or her advocate in that space, is not actually a second witness. And she's there to give her support. In a space where a woman's voice is likely to be dismissed, like, because the context of the ayah is people are fighting over money. You're supposed to write it down, write it down, write it down. If you have a business dealing, write it down. They didn't write it down. They lost their written record. Now we have to call on the witnesses. Now what are we going to do? And there's this discussion back and forth. And if it's one male and one female witness, in a patriarchy, chances are you're going to dismiss the woman because it is contentious. So now we're giving her a second advocate. And in a space where women are likely to be dismissed, have people be her ally. So the women in the Obama administration did this, where any time someone would say, one of the women would speak out, someone else would echo what she said. So if Arij said, not lunch because we're fasting, let's get iftar, I would immediately say, Arij just said, let's get iftar. Just to make sure that it's attributed to her. So if a man comes, Bob walks in later, he's like, let's get iftar. And they're like, great idea, Bob. And if Arij says, hey, that was my idea, and they're like, okay, Arij, stop being petty. It doesn't matter whose opinion it was. It's only being said to women, which is really fascinating. So in that space, it's giving her a support. in a place where it might be contentious. And Ansa Tamra actually mentioned this, especially in the Me Too moment, where she's saying it's really easy to, like, if a woman comes into a courtroom or walks into a police precinct or whatever it is, that there are organizations that actually send advocates with these women so that she's not standing there on her own. And it's really easy to intimidate someone and be like, but did that really happen? Was it this? Was it that? What were you doing? What were you wearing? What was blah, 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 blah? And all the junk that are put on victims. Then it's saying, trying to put the onus on her of like, what were you doing? It's sending in another advocate because this woman is in a position where she's traumatized and she needs someone to be like, shh, don't talk to her that way. So there's a lot of benefit to having support within women. And this isn't something only women can do. If Arij in the meeting said, hey, let's get iftar, any one of her supporters, male or female, can say, hey, that was Arij's idea. You're just echoing and amplifying her voice. And I remember just sitting with that ayah and I'm like, wow, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually giving us the support that we need. And I fell in love with that ayah all over again after I was like, because to be honest, for a long time I struggled with it. For a long time I would read the tafsir and I'm like, something's wrong with what this man is saying. I didn't have a problem with the Quran. I had a problem with this person's interpretation of the Quran. And alhamdulillah, just going through that experience that I was like, okay, this makes sense. I don't recommend anyone being on the board of a masjid unless if you really have to. It's a struggle. But if that's what I learned from 4.5 years, to understand at least one ayah of the Quran more, so worth it. Alhamdulillah, I ended up in therapy for a long time, but it's okay. Are there any environmental or biological factor contributing to this argument? I don't know. I think in terms of how societies view men and women, the majority of societies, unfortunately, are patriarchies, and this is just the way that societies have been. It is trying to create that balance. There are a number of ahadith, there's not, the meaning of it is prophetic, even if the exact wording is not, where it's saying that لا يكرمهن إلا كريم ولا ينهرهن إلا لئيم. The only a noble, dignified person treats women well, and only a sly, cunning, like inherently evil person mistreats women. Because if I'm looking at society and thinking, what can I get away with? Then that's how I'm going to treat women. And this is true, male or female. Some of the biggest supporters of patriarchy are other women. Like, I remember walking into the masjid, and I was not afraid of the men. I was afraid of some of the aunties. Of like, I don't know how, like, they are the ones that are like, no, you shouldn't do this. You should sit in a corner and be quiet. And I'm like, says who? But just because you're like, this is the reason I think it's important to talk about this, is morality is not gender specific. As a woman, I can be oppressive to other women. I can be oppressive to other groups of people. And just because you are inherently vulnerable doesn't mean that you don't have to still go through your own spiritual process of supporting those who are vulnerable, whatever their vulnerabilities are. I actually think it's really ingenious that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created half of humanity different from the other. If in my family, in my most intimate relationships, I can look at someone that has a very different experience in the world than I do, and still see their humanity and love them for it, then I should be able to do that for anyone else that someone might have a different experience. I should be able to still empathize with them. So one of we were talking, I remember the last session that we had, when we were talking about environmentalism, where someone was saying, I think it was Tahani, that she was saying that because I didn't experience this as a white person, therefore racism must not be real. It's like, but okay, but other people have different experiences. If I understand what it's like to overcome my gender barrier to see the humanity of the people in my family, I should be able to overcome a race barrier to see that someone else had a different experience than me. And this isn't just specifically about race, like someone that has a different socioeconomic status. If they say, hey, I'm struggling with this, I should be able to believe them even if that wasn't my experience. Because I fundamentally understand that human beings have different experiences from each other. SubhanAllah. I had there's hadith that I really, really love. When the first day that you walk into seminary, they teach you this hadith, and they teach this to you so that if you lose sight of this hadith, then you've lost sight of Islam. And it's saying, and it starts off and it says, Ar-Rahimuna yarhamuhum ar-Rahman. The people of compassion and mercy, the most merciful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have mercy on them. Irhamu man fil ard yarhamukum man fis sama. Have compassion for the people on earth, and the ones in the heavens will have compassion on you. And they teach this to you the very first day in seminary so that it puts all of the Islamic tradition within a context that we can hopefully, if I'm walking to the masjid and I'm like, and you're wrong, I totally missed the point. Because it's not in line with that hadith. There's a longer version of that hadith, and there are a number of other hadith that actually where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ana Rahman, khalaqtu rahim, wa shaqaqtu lahu isman min ismi, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am the most merciful, Ar-Rahman, and I created the womb, and I gave it a name from my name. Whoever fulfills their bonds with her, I will fulfill my bonds with them, and whoever breaks their bonds with her, I will cut them off. It's a very intense hadith, and the Prophet ﷺ is narrating this to us, that our relationship with, first, every mom is always going to be like, it means respect your mother. Yes, it does. But it also means as women, we need to respect ourselves. And we need to respect womanhood in general. There's another hadith where the womb is attached to the throne of Allah, speaking for itself, saying, whoever fulfills their bonds with me, Allah will fulfill his bonds with them, and whoever breaks their bonds with me, Allah will cut them off. There's a level of respect of what it means to be a woman. All of our Islamic family law is essentially based in a physical relationship with a woman who has access to that womb, who was born from that womb, and the only extra thing is who this woman might have nursed, and it's related back to, if she had had this child through her womb, this is how we're relating it. All of our Islamic family law is based on this. Our Sharia is based on this. For people to come afterwards and be like, oh, but what does a woman know anyway? I'm like, you're not insulting me. You're insulting the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ. I remember I was talking to someone about the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ, and this person was like, oh, it only counts if your dad is from the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm like, you've got to be kidding. All of it came through his daughter, Fatima, radiallahu anha. Like, the beginning of the chain was a woman. I don't understand how you have somehow decided that it only counts if it's on your father's side when the first person in the chain is the mom, not the father. There's so many of these things that we've internalized in our tradition that are just so frustrating. We were talking yesterday because, alhamdulillah, we have both male and female reciters for our Quran program in the evening. And I was sharing with people that I legitimately had someone tell me, when I was memorizing Quran, what is the point of you memorizing Quran if you're never going to lead Taraweeh? And I'm like, I don't know, it's for Allah. Like, how is this still a conversation that we're having within our community? And even if we're not doing it outright, like, I know so many families that will put in blood, sweat, and tears, money, effort, and time to have their boys go memorize the Quran, and when you ask them, why didn't you send your daughters to memorize Quran too? And they're like, oh yeah, it just didn't occur to me. Why not? We have to have men and women be the carriers of our tradition. That's the only way we can actually carry it intact for the next generation. Otherwise, we're selling the next generation short. SubhanAllah, I want to end with this because Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, I really appreciate him, where he was saying that when he's talking about different culture, the Islam and the cultural imperative, and he's saying Islam is like the clear water, and it takes on the color of the rocks underneath. So Islam in a different cultural context is supposed to function slightly differently. For example, in America, we'll be having more conversations about dogs than they do in Egypt because people in Egypt don't like dogs and don't have them as pets. We're going to be having different conversations. In America, we're going to be talking more about racism and prison reform. They're going to be talking about political prisoners. Just our take on Islam is just going to be focused on different things. This doesn't say that we're all still praying towards the Kaaba. We're all still fasting in Ramadan. We're all doing the acts of worship. We're all collectively doing the same, with the slight variations between the madhahib, and that's fine. The ideals are still all the same. Be just, be kind. But that kindness and justice applies differently in different cultural contexts. If there's part of Islam that inherently falls on the shoulders of scholarship, if all of our scholars are male, we are inherently applying Islam incorrectly. Because if I have to have people deciding for each of those spaces and times how to make Islam relevant to people, I need to have that balance within the gender, otherwise I'm doing it wrong. Like, it's just very frustrating to me every time I've ever had to learn about, like, menstruation from a man. And I'm like, why? This is uncomfortable for him. It's uncomfortable for me. It's uncomfortable all around. Like, why are we doing this? Why don't we have female scholars? And this is new in our tradition. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were tons of female scholars. During the next generation, there were tons of female scholars. When we look at who told us about menstruation from each of those traditions, it was the women, not the men. Why? It makes sense. And you lose the spiritual benefits and understanding that even if a man can tell me these are the rules, he can't tell me this is the spiritual benefit of how to focus when you're on your period on your dua or this or that. It's just not his experience. And it's important that we celebrate everybody and that we are actually giving everyone the voices that they need. Ameen. Areed, should we do the breakout sessions? But there was an important question.
Yeah, if you want to answer one or two of the questions, and then we can do the breakout sessions, and then at the end we can do more questions.
So there was one question about the controversial surah on, quote, hit a woman in Surah An-Nisa. It's really, really frustrating to me how people have used this ayah. Like literally, people who are domestic abusers will quote the Quran against their victims. Like, besides the domestic abuse, that's spiritual abuse. Like, that is insane. So in that ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الرجال قوامون على النساء, and Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, who is, subhanAllah, we were talking about this in another session, but Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu is an authority on the Quran. He's saying, هذه آية تكليف لا تشريف, that this is actually an ayah that is giving men responsibility and is not giving them some kind of honor of saying, hey, you get to decide things. That's not what the ayah is saying. It is telling the men you have responsibilities towards the women. When the ayah continues, there's more than one point in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this idea of nushuz. So within a marriage, the idea of nushuz is that someone inherently feels like they are above someone else. Nashazatil ard, in like a physical representation of nushuz, is like if a part, like it's the opposite of a sinkhole. If a part of the earth just arbitrarily goes up. It's out of place, but it's putting itself above something else. Any spouse that looks at the person they are married to and says, I could have done better than you, that marriage is doomed. Because you feel like you're above the other person. So in this ayah, it's saying, what if the wife has nushuz? And in another ayah in the same surah, it says, what if the husband is the one doing the nushuz? So this idea that it's inherently, women just need to listen to their husbands, that's not a thing. Like, it's talking about a balance between the husband and the wife. And here it's saying, فَالْقَانِتَاتُ حَافِظَاتُ لِلْغَيْبِ بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ, those women who are obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Unfortunately, some of the translations like, it's the women that are obedient to their husband. In every other place in the Quran where it talks about qunut, we are talking about obedience to Allah, not obedience to any other human being. And somehow, magically, people have decided that this means obedience to the husband. Not a thing. This is a part in the Quran where it's saying, now you have a problem in your marriage. Now what are we supposed to do? You separate the beds, you put in a mediator, you do this whole list of things, and then the last part where it says فَضْرِبُوهُنَّ. So daraba in the Quran could mean a number of different things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says ضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you a striking example. It doesn't mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hit you upside the head. That's not what it means. Some scholars said daraba here means to actually physically separate from each other, of like, at this point your marriage is done, you need to have a trial separation. Wallahu alam. The tradition of the Prophet ﷺ never had a husband hitting a wife. And in the cases where there were domestic violence, the Prophet ﷺ not only told the men off of you're not allowed to do that, you just don't have that sense of control over any other human being to abuse them. You don't own another human being. They are the trust of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I don't understand. There was the people that went to the Prophet ﷺ and said domestic violence happened. He got really angry at the men. There was one incident where he said, the first one that came to him, he said, okay, eye for an eye. This is how we're going to do it. And then Jibreel alayhi salam revealed something to the Prophet ﷺ that is saying when you look at domestic violence situations, hitting the husband can actually become very, very dangerous for the wife afterwards. Because he feels like I went through this pain and it is your fault. Also, because it's such a complicated relationship, the wife is there. It's not that she completely hates her husband. There's still complicated feelings of love, even though there is abuse. So if she sees him in pain because of something she's done, now she's saying, oh, it is my fault. And it just keeps digging that hole deeper and deeper and deeper for the victim. And the goal is to end that cycle, not to dig it deeper. So in that moment, the Prophet ﷺ said, hey, maybe eye for an eye is not necessarily the best response. But that didn't take away the idea that there had to be a punishment and there had to be a recourse for him hitting his wife. During the Khilafah of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anh, there was a woman that went to him. Her husband had clearly hit her. And he says, do you want in this marriage? And she says no. And he's like, you are hereby divorced. I don't even need to ask his permission. He has given up his right to be a husband. This idea that somehow a man has a right to hit his wife, insane. And especially, I think Arij had talked about this early on, and like this the current state of Islamophobia, where people are like, oh, the Quran says a husband can hit his wife. No, it doesn't. Nowhere else, when it says darban fil ard, it says traveling through, it means traveling through the earth. It doesn't mean hitting the earth. That's not what it means. And yet somehow we want to take this narrow, horrible interpretation of the Quran and be like, this is it. No, it's not. Wallahu alam. Sorry for the rant. Someone shared a book. Oh yes, that is a really cool book. The Tao of Islam. About the balance of the genders. SubhanAllah.
If anyone has any other resources that they like to use to learn more about women in Islam, that's something that we're also going to be touching on in our breakout rooms, which is the next thing that we're going to be moving on to. So basically, in each of your breakout rooms, there will be a student facilitator, and they'll be leading the discussion and reflection. We'll do that for like 8 to 10 minutes, and then inshallah we'll all circle back and have some last closing words. So I'm just going to send you all to your breakout rooms.
Did I do okay? Eddie, should I go to a breakout room too?
Yeah, I'll send you to one. Or can you join one yourself?
I got it.
Sabbath.
Assalamualaikum.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Sorry, I'm used to fighting about this a lot. Oh my god, I've gotten myself kicked out of so many masajid where they're just like, women can't pray here. I'm like, yep, Allahu Akbar. Wait till I'm done. Because it's a lot of time. Yell at me after. What do you guys